One of the most intriguing questions in the history of World War II is this. What would have happened if Nazi Germany had never invaded the Soviet Union? The invasion of the USSR, known as Operation Barbarossa, was one of the most important and riskiest decisions made by Adolf Hitler. But imagine for a moment a different scenario. Imagine if Hitler had decided not to wage a gigantic war in the East. Could the outcome of World War II have been different? To understand this possibility, we first need to look at the situation in Germany in 1941. At that time, the Nazi regime was at the height of its power in Europe. France had been quickly defeated, much of the continent was under German control, and the German army seemed virtually unbeatable. On the other side of the English Channel, only the United Kingdom continued to resist. Even so, the British position was extremely precarious. The country had survived the Battle of Britain, but faced enormous difficulties. Meanwhile, the United States had not yet officially entered the war. Although they were already helping the British through the Lend-Lease Act program, the country remained outside the direct conflict. It was precisely in this context that Hitler made a historic decision to attack the Soviet Union. For the Nazi regime, the war against communism was not merely strategic, it was ideological. In Hitler's view, Eastern Europe should be transformed into territory for German expansion, the so-called Levant. Furthermore, the Soviet Union possessed extremely valuable natural resources. The agricultural fields of Ukraine, and especially the oil of the Caucasus region, were seen as fundamental to sustaining the German war economy. However, opening a gigantic front against the Soviet Union brought devastating consequences. The war in the East became the largest land conflict in history. Millions of soldiers died, enormous resources were consumed, and the German army was eventually slowly worn down in brutal battles. But let's imagine an alternative scenario. What if Hitler had decided to follow a different path? One possibility would have been to concentrate all efforts on defeating the United Kingdom. Instead of starting a new war in the East, Germany could have dedicated more time to preparing an invasion of Great Britain. This operation had been planned previously and was known as Operation Sea Lion. In practice, however, this mission would have been extremely difficult. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, was much smaller than the powerful Royal Navy. Furthermore, the British Air Force, the Royal Air Force, had already demonstrated its defensive capabilities during the air battle over England. Even with more time to prepare, an amphibious invasion of the British Isles would have been an extremely risky operation. Another strategic alternative could have emerged in the south. Instead of attacking the Soviet Union, Hitler could have focused his attention on the Mediterranean and North Africa. In this scenario, the famous General Erwin Rommel could have received much larger reinforcements for his army, the Afrika Korps, with more troops, tanks, and aircraft. The Germans might have been able to conquer Egypt and take control of the strategic Suez Canal. If this had happened, the impact on the Allies would have been enormous. The Suez Canal was one of the most important routes connecting the British Empire. Without it, the transport of troops, oil, and resources from the Middle East could have been seriously compromised. In an even bolder scenario, German forces could have advanced towards the Middle East. Regions like Iraq and Iran possessed extremely important oil reserves. If Germany managed to control these areas, it would have had access to vital energy resources to sustain its war machine. But there's also a third interesting possibility. What if Hitler hadn't canceled the invasion of the Soviet Union, only postponed it? If Operation Barbarossa had begun in 1942, for example, Germany would have gained more time to strengthen its army and exploit the resources of the occupied territories in Europe. On the other hand, this delay would also have given the Soviets a great advantage. In 1941, the Red Army was still in the process of reorganization after the political purges carried out by Joseph Stalin. With Marchimi, the Soviets could have reinforced their defenses and expanded the production of modern weapons. Among them were pieces of equipment that would become famous during the war, such as the T-34 tank and the Katyusha rocket launcher. With a better prepared army, the German invasion would likely have encountered even greater resistance. This could have transformed the conflict into an even longer and more destructive war. Ultimately, these scenarios remain only in the realm of historical speculation. But they helped highlight something very important. The decision to invade the Soviet Union ended up being one of the most decisive turning points of the war. By opening a gigantic front in the East, Germany found itself trapped in a multi-front war against enemies with far superior industrial resources. And over time, this attrition eventually led to the collapse of the Nazi regime. History is often shaped by individual decisions. and few choices have had such profound consequences as the one made by Hitler in 1941.